Good evening, everyone. I'm John Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. I recommend you go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab because we are in the midst of a series, an ever-expanding series on the topic of forgiveness, which comes in the overall umbrella category of dealing with boundaries. Because you cannot establish firm boundaries if you are not sure that you have the right to do so. And what about those that have significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted the course of your life? You probably at some point in time have been told that you need to forgive. You need to forgive and forget, bury the hatchet, move on, let bygones be bygones. That is very common, but that is as distorted as it gets. And that puts me at odds with a lot of the counseling world and many pastors because many parishioners, many people who have gone to church have heard that there is blanket forgiveness no matter what. And they have conveyed that that's how God operates. Well, if you've been with us for the past number of weeks, and if you haven't, again, go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab because we're going to hit the ground running. The context is there. We have done multiple programs and we're looking at what is the truth behind forgiveness? How did Jesus view this? Is it that he would echo the meme that we have often looked at? It's worth looking at again. I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology that I never received. That sounds so spiritual, but that is so deadly. That will tie someone up in knots. God has come, Jesus came to set us free. If you believe this meme is correct, that you never knew how strong you were until you had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology you never received, you are going to be tied up in knots. You are trying to do something that is impossible, and not because you're not spiritual enough, and not because you need God's love to be able to do it, but it is impossible, just as trying to fly by flapping your wings off a third-story building. It's impossible because it's not possible, because it's inaccurate. We are never told in Scripture to forgive someone who isn't sorry. Does that make us unforgiving? No. We are to go to our brother, if in doubt, to let them know what happened, but we're actually talking about significant things that anybody would know that they've done. Matthew chapter 5, near the end of the verse, places the responsibility on the guilty party. If you're at the altar presenting your gift and you suddenly remember that you have been significantly hurtful, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to leave your gift at the altar and go make it right. Go make it right with who? The person you have negatively impacted. What happens if you don't? Well, you go from being real to religious, and now you're under serious judgment. How can I say that? Because the injured party is going where? Going to the judge. And if the person gets to the judge, and who's the judge in that case? It is the Father. It is God himself. There's only one God. It's God. That if the plaintiff, if the injured party gets to him, you're in trouble. What's going to happen? You're going to be thrown in prison and have to pay the very last farthing, as the old King James says. Meaning you're going to be in real trouble. So the onus has always been with God that the guilty party is the one that bears responsibility, not the injured party. To invert that, or to say that all sins are the same, is a distortion of God's heart. Not all sins are the same. Have we all sinned? Of course. We've all fallen short of God's glory. So does that mean there's no salvation? Of course there's salvation, but unconditional forgiveness with God is very conditional, and it's conditioned upon what? Meaning, does everybody get to go to heaven? We've covered this before. There is no universal salvation. What is the price of admission into heaven? It's 1 John 1:9. If we confess, that is to say the exact same thing as. So it is incumbent upon the sinner, it's incumbent upon the person who has done the deed to be the one to take the step and to acknowledge and confess in brokenness and contrition that had better match the offense. If there's no confession, then there is no forgiveness. So we are to forgive as God forgives. God does not forgive someone that doesn't confess. He does not expect someone to forgive someone that hasn't confessed. Why? Because that means the person isn't sorry. And therefore, it's not forgiveness, it's enabling. And what is that person going to continue to do? They will continue to be hurtful. And then the blood of future victims, whether metaphorically or not, the pain of future victims is on your hands, is on our hands. God expects us to reflect his heart, both in terms of forgiveness, but in terms of judgment, in terms of the seriousness of the offense. Why? Because his heart is for those who have been harmed. Justice responds to injustice. Why? Because God is receptive to the cries of those who are being negatively impacted. That is what a loving God's heart does. That's what moves his heart. So, this teaching that says that if someone has not confessed, then you shouldn't worry about it. That is the polar opposite of what God says. God wants those that have been hurtful to reach the point where they are broken and contrite. So if in doubt, Jesus said, you go to your brother. But the kind of impact, the kind of injustice that we're talking about is not the kind that somebody would forget about. As we've talked about previously, we're talking about the difference between um, minor issues and major issues. And we made the case last time, I will bring it up again, that there is a verse, and we looked at it, where Jesus said, love your enemies. And somebody asked, well, what does that mean? And we looked at that. I'm going to reference it again, but on a scale of 1 to 10, here are the degrees of hurtfulness. This is the best way to understand negative impact. And we're talking, scale 1 to 10, we're talking way up there. Talking murder, rape, sexual abuse, relentlessly pursuing someone who would dare to stand up for what is right, just, and fair. How about spousal betraying? And the guilty party then is going after the innocent party for daring to seek a divorce or to set boundaries. How about a business partner that takes you for all you have and then is going to rub salt in the wounds, is going to sue you? How about family members who seriously and continuously slander your name and reputation for daring to have boundaries? That is what we are talking about when it comes to the issue of forgiveness versus what somebody is still accountable for, as far as if they haven't um, accepted responsibility, if they haven't confessed. So, to properly understand the book of Psalms, you have to understand we're not talking about persecution, and that's the level that Jesus talked about. Love your enemies. Those are persecutors. And as we've talked about before, those are individuals who are trying to silence the truth. Okay, it is not personal. So we talked about paneros. Those are the people that are persecuting. They are doing evil and they are enemies, but it is not personal. They just want you to shut your mouth, right? They're reacting to what you represent. But Sapphoros and Kakos, as we talked about, those are two very different categories of people. Those are qualitatively evil people. And so we looked at, for the past couple of programs, I recommend you go back and look at those. These are two different categories of people. And we have to understand this because the motivation is very different on the part of these individuals. And so there is a difference between the people that will be persecuting you. In the Beatitudes, or Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, right? There is a description of what will happen if somebody begins to stand up for what is right. That is, those are different categories. So if emotional healing is to take place for a survivor or somebody that has been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted by somebody, we have to understand the different categories because there's a different application being brought to bear. So we've highlighted the reality that Jesus made a distinction between a selfish person or selfish people who do evil in terms of persecuting people versus the dogs and the pigs. So we've looked at that extensively in the past, versus those who are enemies, not because you're a person and they want to harm you, but because they are reacting to the fact that you are salt and light. And I wanted to bring up there is a parallel passage because we looked at Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew. We looked at what is the actual word for evil person, right? Meaning we are to love our enemies, and so we looked at the word poneros. Okay, that is a specific category of people who are not. I'm going to find it here. Right, let me bring my picture back up here. They are reacting to what you represent. There we go. Not the fact that they want to harm you. So again, we looked at this before. Poneros is the word that is used in both Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 45, and Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 35. So it's a very different thing than kakos and sapros. Those are wicked and evil people. I'm going to bring up then in Luke, because we only referenced Matthew before, but see if some of these words look familiar. Now, these are going to be two different words that we have not seen, and I want to show you what these are, because these are used in both Matthew and in Luke. So we have the word as far as enemies, we have ekthros. Okay, you can see it in the Greek there. So. What does ekthros mean? You look down bottom left, it says an enemy, right? Jesus said, love your enemies, but that means someone who's openly hostile, animated by deep-seated hatred. Well, that is not a pig and a dog, and that is not an oppressor. This is someone who is reactive. So it implies irreconcilable hostility proceeding out of a personal hatred or bent on inflicting harm. Okay, that is not a pig or dog or someone who is a psychopath, as we've talked about, or a fool. Okay, it describes a person involved or resolved to inflict harm, driven by irreconcilable differences. There is another word that I want you to see. That is going to be we're still in Luke now. I want you to see that in both parallel passages, the same words are used. So we have ekros, again for enemies, love your enemies, and there is our word poneros. So both in Matthew and Luke, it uses the same exact words. As a matter of fact, I'm going to bring up also the term for those that have hatred. Okay, I'm going to find it here just for a second here. There we are. So in Luke, and it's the same one. This is for hating. Bless those that hate you. Okay, so this word hate is not a personal thing. Okay, it's from it means to detest, by extension, also in comparative disregard. But when you see that in both of those passages, what it means is this: those that we are to love as far as our enemies are persecutors. These are not people that are oppressors. And there's an important difference. So we've looked at in the past three different categories now of different kinds of people. And I want to show you who we're talking about because this matters uh, completely, because when it comes to the issue of forgiveness, to tell someone to forgive the wrong category is going to be a distortion of God's heart. We have looked at in the past this chart. So we have the person on the right who is the hurtful person. We call them the pigs and the dogs. Remember out of Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus said, "Do not take what is special, give it to dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine." So we've made the case that on the right, at this level, that's a pig and a dog. And if you hang around pigs and dogs, what's going to happen to you? You are going to end up feeling like this because Jesus said they're going to take your pearls, your time, effort, energy, and resources and do what with it? They're going to trample it. And therefore, you're going to feel the effects of it. And in that particular case, Jesus doesn't want you around that kind of person. So we're not talking about, in this case, as far as oppressors, we're not talking about the pigs and dogs because we are not to be around them. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting. Let me bring up where Jesus says, let me find the exact verse here, where he says, do not be around them. I'm sorry, the pigs and the dogs. But when he says that, bless those that curse you, and he says to give to those, I don't have the passage in front of me, sorry. But he says, give to those who ask of you. Oh, wait a second, because that's in the passage of persecution. Go an extra mile. Give to those, don't withhold. But Jesus said with dogs and pigs, we aren't to give our pearls, cast our pearls before swine. So it shows you then oppressors are in a different category as the pigs and dogs. We are not to give pigs and dogs what is special. If you do, then you are disobedient. Jesus is not going to contradict himself within 2 chapters of the book of Matthew. Okay, so it's important to understand that the pigs and the dogs, what we've talked about thus far, is different than a persecutor. Okay, a persecutor is going to be somebody that once we get away from the pigs and dogs and we are starting to move upward and onward with life. So here has been a chart that we've used. Yeah, see, Lord says, don't do it. Do not, right? Do not bring pain upon yourself. Okay. So we have we've talked about the idea of not going into the fog, right? That's where all the toxic relationships, that's where all the pigs and the dogs and psychopaths and the users and manipulators are. You want to come out and move upward and onward, right? So if you go into the fog, you bring pain upon yourself. So in the fog, this is not what we're talking about when it comes to persecution or oppression. If you go into the fog, you will end up inviting all sorts of pain upon yourself. And you will have people, see, don't do it. Can you hear the background sound that we got all sorts of lightning going on? Okay. This is not spiritual to have all those people hanging on you, right? This is not persecution. This is not oppression. This is foolishness. And if you end up accepting the responsibility of other people, you will feel like that. And we've talked about that before. So again, when we're talking about oppression and we're talking or persecution, it is not this. Okay? It is not this kind of relationship. This is to be avoided. Why? Because all you end up with is tremendous stress. So Jesus said, he already told us, do not be in that kind of relationship. So the assumption is this: you've left the fog people behind. You've left the pigs and dogs behind. You are now moving upward and onward toward maturity. When you do that, you're going to be on the straight and narrow, right? There's one of the pictures of the straight and narrow. And if we stay on there, the Lord's going to direct our path. Sometimes we will encounter challenges, but ultimately, It is on the path coming up out of the fog that we will grow. And we have looked at this in the past. These are the stages of spiritual growth. This is what we do want. So once we are moving towards a life of spiritual growth, then that is when we're going to begin to experience either persecution. Why? Because as we move out of the fog, we start to become effective. And that is what will get the attention of hurtful individuals. So there are two kinds of hurtful people, or two kinds of enemies, as Jesus taught, as we've looked at. Okay, so the first kind is oppressors. Persecutors. And we looked at that last time. I'm going to bring those charts back up, because the best way to understand, if I can, there we are. We looked at this chart last time to understand once somebody gets off the straight and narrow, in terms of selfishness, there will be a progression downward. As selfishness grows, the person will start to morph into different categories. And the more selfish they become, the more hurtful they become. And look at how God responds. We need to be able to reflect to people reality. And the first group of people that we want to be able to reflect reality to are those that are being hurtful. We want to help people understand who are increasingly hurtful that there's an increasing degree of judgment that is in store for them if they continue to become hurtful, if they give themselves permission to override their conscience. So you can see, again, how distorted a meme like this is. I never knew how strong it was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. Well, the question is, who is it that won't admit or confess or issue an apology? It is going to be somebody beyond the -3 category. So there's a couple of different ways to look at these different categories as far as -3. And let's see if I can grab this. Now that's going to be a previous. There we are. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. So we've got different angles, right, of descent. So on the far left, you see we're between a -3 and a -4 with that person. At this point, the person on the left needs to get away from the person on the right, because more than likely you're dealing with a dog and a pig. Well, a dog and a pig, now we're going to look at the same minus numbers, but now kind of going horizontally, but descending. So you can see where it says fool. By the time somebody has become a fool, we saw that in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22, there are three categories that are listed. So in the first chart, the background chart, meaning the one that's now overlaid, these are all biblical terms. And it is important for the survivor, as well as the perpetrator, as well as the oppressor, to understand there are different categories. The further somebody goes downhill, they will morph from one category to the next, and there will be a decreasing likelihood on the part of the hurtful person that there's a decreasing likelihood they're going to respond appropriately to their conscience. So you can reach a point, a selfish person can reach a point where their conscience no longer bothers them. That matches when somebody becomes a fool. So we looked at last time Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22. And we're going to read this. There we are. And we're going to see that God is God is an equal opportunity God. The Jews understood that. And it is incumbent upon us to understand that as well, because God let the Jews know that if they enter, meaning they as people, if they enter certain categories, they will be doing certain degrees of harm. They will become oppressive, and so he will act on behalf of those being hurtful. We looked at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22. I want to read it again with you. So God says, how long, you simpletons, will you insist upon being simple-minded? How long, you mockers, relish mocking? How long will you fools hate knowledge? All right, come listen to my counsel. I will share my heart with you. So God is trying to let someone know that they don't have to end up experiencing his wrath. So he is trying to speak to each of these categories. He says this, I called you so often, but you wouldn't come. I reached out to you, but you paid no attention. You ignored my advice and rejected the correction I offered. So how's God going to respond? So I will laugh when you're in trouble. I will mock you when disaster overtakes you, when calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster engulfs you like a cyclone and anguish and distress overwhelm you. When you cry for help, how's God going to respond? He's not going to answer. Though they anxiously search for me, they what? They will not find me, for they hated knowledge and chose not to fear the Lord. They rejected my advice and paid no attention when I corrected them. Therefore what? They must eat the bitter fruit of living their own way and choking on their own schemes. For simpletons turn away from me to death. Fools are destroyed by their own complacency. You notice on the far right, on the top, what is a fool eligible for? And inertia, in terms of growing ego, is doing what? It's taking them into the target zone. Well, it's important to understand that God's heart has not changed. So we just read Proverbs chapter 1 that was written to the Jews about 1000 BC. Well, let's fast forward a couple of hundred years now to 700 BC in the book of Isaiah. God is going to address the Babylonians. And this will ring a bell to the Jews, where they will quickly understand that God is equal opportunity. They can take heart in that if anybody becomes oppressive, remember the promise of God, the last words of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32 was what? That he would avenge. So his promise, the last words of God through Moses before Moses dies to God's people was God would avenge injustice that was perpetrated upon them. Look at what God says to the Babylonians. Oh, beautiful Babylon, sit now in darkness and silence. Never again will you be known as the queen of kingdoms. Okay, there's ego. For I was angry with my chosen people. So what happened? Equal opportunity. God warned the Jews, his people, that if they continued to go downhill, that he would bring judgment. But what happened to the people, the oppressors that God actually used to bring judgment? It says this, for I was angry with my chosen people and punished them by letting them fall into your hands. But you, Babylon, showed no mercy. You did what? Oppressed even the elderly. God's saying, you're so bad. You're so bad that you oppressed even the elderly. Meaning this is as bad as it gets. You said, I'll reign forever as queen of the world. You did not reflect upon your actions or think about your consequences. We've made the case in the past. The further someone gets off the path, they start morphing eventually into the realm of having a reprobate mind, which is the polar opposite of God's. Instead of loving people and using things, instead of understanding good and bad, right and wrong intuitively from God's perspective, they lose the ability to think God's thoughts and view things from his perspective. So isn't it interesting that they no longer reflect on their actions or think about their consequences? That is a telltale sign of someone who is a reprobate, is someone who is an oppressor. If someone's never going to reflect upon their actions, if someone's never going to think about the consequences, are they ever going to repent? Are they ever going to confess? No. So what happens if you say to that person, in essence, you don't need to admit anything. You don't need to confess. You're giving them a false sense of security because they are under what? They're under God's judgment. Go down to the bottom. Now, verse 18, you felt secure in your wickedness like no one sees me, but your wisdom and knowledge, that would jog the Jew's mind right there. What's a book of wisdom? It's a book of Proverbs. But your wisdom and knowledge have led you astray, and you said, I'm the only one. There is no one like me. Yeah, there's low self-esteem. So here it is. So disaster will overtake you, and you won't be able to charm it away. Calamity will fall upon you, and you won't be able to buy your way out of it. Catastrophe will strike you suddenly, one for which you are not prepared. Now, I want to go back to look at verse 26 of Proverbs chapter 1. So I'll laugh when you're in trouble. I will mock when what? Disaster overtakes you, when calamity overtakes you. So we have disaster, calamity. When disaster engulfs you like a cyclone, and anguish and distress. Read verse 10 again, 300 years later. But your wisdom and knowledge. So disaster will overtake you. You won't be able to charm it. Calamity. So we have disaster and calamity and catastrophe. What do you think the message that God is giving, not just to the Babylonians, but to the Jews? Because he says, you're not going to be able to charm this away with your wisdom. He was giving them the message that the Babylonians went too far. So anybody that goes too far through these different categories, remember in the book of Proverbs, he's referencing those three different categories, that if somebody ends up going downhill, they are eligible for what? For judgment. Why? Because God cares about the pain that those categories are causing. The first category doesn't necessarily cause another person pain, but they're going to be moving downhill because they are open to the influence of other selfish people who are going to influence them, not for good, but they will probably influence them at the very start to override their conscience, not to worry about it. And they'll probably also be the ones to say, you know what, it's no big deal. And then all they need is someone to come along and say, you know what, never knew how strong I was when I found out that I could forgive someone that never apologized. That is feeding into the exact mindset of a selfish person who's becoming a mocker and an oppressor. And that is not what God says. What God says is, on behalf of the injured party, the selfish person had better think carefully, because God cares about the pain of those who have been negatively impacted. That is who has God's heart, not the hurtful person. And we will continue on the other side of the break as we're going to look at the best way to understand from a Jew's perspective, from the people of God, from their perspective, the way God views selfishness and the way he upholds those that have been harmed. And we will look at that on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you, in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation, or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. We're picking up where we left off prior to the break, or prior to this half of the program. We're continuing our series on forgiveness. What is it, or what it is versus what it is not? And in the midst of that series, which comes out of a larger series on boundaries, we have been tackling the issue, what did Jesus mean by love your enemies? We found out that there are different categories. The Jews understood that. Jesus used specific words that differentiated the idea of oppression versus persecution. When he said, love your enemies, when he said, do good to those that despitefully use you, he used a category that was reserved for persecution. The people involved in persecution are different than people that are oppressors. Persecutors, Paul said he did that in ignorance. God understands the heart of someone that's persecuting, though they can perpetrate great harm, but their heart is different. They are reacting to truth and light. They are not out to harm someone for the sake of harming them. That is an oppressor. So it's very clear. And we need to be clear on behalf of those that are being harmed, those that have been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted. We have to get this right as far as who did Jesus tell us to forgive? It's those who have confessed and those who acted out of ignorance. Paul said he was eligible for forgiveness. Why? He acted out of ignorance. When Jesus was on the cross and he said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. That's ignorance. We know it's not universal forgiveness. We know Judas was not forgiven. We know the scribes and Pharisees and religious leaders and high priest were not forgiven. Who was he? We know that it's not all the passers-by that were forgiven. Who was he talking about? Well, if we could have been there, I submit we would have seen his eyes focus right down at the foot of the cross. Who was there? The Roman soldiers. They had committed great harm to him, but they did it out of ignorance. And one of them, the centurion, he had his eyes opened. And so he was forgiven when he confessed. So for those that persecute, that is out of ignorance. That's different than oppression. So those that persecute are eligible for forgiveness. We have looked at the categories. And why does this matter? Categories of hurtfulness. Part of that hurt comes from the persecutors. Look right in the middle. You'll see the word persecution. As someone gets off the straight and narrow, they're moving downhill. They will possibly become a persecutor, or persecutor ends right about there in terms of his disposition. Though he can perpetrate, he can commit very heinous things, including executing someone, but he's not going to take a thrill out of generating pain. That's an oppressor. And so you see the categories. We looked at that before the break as well as last time. I recommend you go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab. We have a growing repository of these programs that'll give you the context. But in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22, we see that God listed three categories. And we saw before the break that 300 years later, when God was addressing the Babylonians who crossed lines, who became oppressors, God used the same terminology to help the Jews understand, as well as the Babylonians understand, that God is an equal opportunity God when it comes to injustice. Why? Because he cares deeply about those that are being harmed. His heart is for those that have been hurt. His heart is not for those that are hurtful. And if you give someone who has been on the receiving end of an oppressor, and again, just for the sake of review, one quick look at it, when we're talking about persecution versus oppression and the level that we're talking about where the majority of the book of Psalms comes in. We're talking about significant harm. Okay, something that will change the course of somebody's life. That is not a minor issue. So if you are inclined to tell someone that they need to forgive and forget, God doesn't do that. Because the oppressor, one thing that will mark the oppressor is there's a decreasing likelihood they will ever confess. And without confession, there is no forgiveness of sins. So God wants us to reflect his character to those that are being harmed. Why? because we are to set the captives free. Our job is to reflect his heart, and his heart is clearly laid out, and the Jews understood it, that depending upon what category, and you can see across the top, God will respond in different ways depending upon the degree of injustice. Why? Because he cares about people that are being negatively impacted. It was God's promise to take note of and keep track of and take action on behalf of those being harmed. That would be the promise that would keep God's people stable and fixed. That's Psalm 91:1. He who remains under the shadow of the Almighty will remain stable and fixed. When you are being attacked, when you are being oppressed, using that specific word, it is very hard to stay stable and fixed. But what is going to help you maintain that? 46% of the book of Psalms are imprecatory prayers. David constantly references God's promise, singular. He also references God's promises, plural, but more times than not, it's going to be promise, singular. That's referencing back to the last words that God spoke through Moses about promising to avenge injustice. That's what David stated time and time again, that kept him stable, kept him fixed, and also that he would sing about God's promise. About what? His faithfulness and loving kindness. It would enable the people of God to know that God's promise of vengeance would enable them to be still rather than taking matters into their own hands. Because it's very difficult. Here comes all the pressure. Psalm 37 is a very good psalm in terms of anger management because it says, be still, right? Don't let it build up. Not that we don't have the right to experience the anger. The flip side of hurt is anger, but God is offering a tremendous gift. Why? Because if we take matters into our own hands, we run the risk of what? Of going too far. It's a tremendous gift that God gives us. This shirt is great, right? I'm going to let God fix it, meaning what? Take matter. He's going to do it. Because if I fix it, I'm going to jail. Okay, that's the heart of an imprecatory prayer. That it's not that I don't have the right to experience my anger, but if I really get in touch with my anger, I may go too far. The response to injustice has to match the category. But what happens if someone is under God's wrath and I destroy them? Well, then I'm taking it too far. So it's a wonderful gift that God gives the survivor of his promise of vengeance. Not to say, vengeance is mine, how dare you? No, what God says is, I care so much about you that I'm going to take it up on your behalf. That's a beautiful promise of God. God's justice is blind. The Jews understood that. In Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 14, let me see if I have that one with me. I may not, so I'm just going to read it here. It says this: when you enter the land that the Lord your God has given you, be careful not to imitate the detestable customs of the nations living there. For example, never sacrifice your son or daughter as a burnt offering. That's the ultimate of injustice. And don't let the people, he lists off getting into witchcraft and all sorts of stuff. Anyone who does these things is detestable. And it's because of the other nations who have done these things that I'm driving them out. Now I'm going to paraphrase, using you guys. But if you also, I'm paraphrasing, but if you do that, do what? Perpetrate great harm. I'll take you out as well. So what is God telling the Jews? That first, that's humbling for them, right? They need to know they're nothing special in a way. They were special because he chose them. But if they also went downhill and started perpetrating, if they were playing the fool, what would he do? He would also do what? He would take matters into his hands and on behalf of those that they were harming. So God constantly wanted the Jews to understand that this issue of justice is the foremost thing that is closest to God's heart. Why? Because he is protective. Justice only makes sense when injustice happens. That's when justice kicks into gear. And when injustice has been perpetrated, you don't perpetrate injustice to an inanimate object. You may have poor stewardship, but you're not perpetrating injustice. You can only perpetrate injustice against a person. And so the Jews understood that God placed a premium on treating people in a right, just, and fair fashion. So they understood the concept of the slippery slope and these different categories. That the further you go, the more the snowball starts to build, and the more you violate your conscience, and the easier it is to become unjust. So the Jews saw a relationship with God in terms of a continuum. I'm either right with God and also then moving upward and onward. Again, here's another kind, we've seen this before, right? I'm either moving downward in disobedience into the fog where my ego grows, and or I'm open to those, I'm being foolish, I'm open to those that are going to take advantage of me, the pigs and the dogs, or I'm moving upward and onward. As we have an opportunity to decide in my right Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 and 6, you see the little trail right there. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. So he's being tempted to take matters into his own hands. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. So Satan, the temptation is going to be just take the shortcut. In all your ways acknowledge him and he'll direct your path. So right now that person is being tempted to take matters into their own hands and go into the fog. And if they go into the fog, what happens to them? They're going the wrong direction. So there's no spiritual or character development. That is what God wants for us. He wants to grow us up. But if I start to become selfish, then what happens is I take myself off the path. And here's how the Jews understood it. I'm moving from left to right. And what's happening is, you can see that's actual drawing. As I was starting to understand this concept, of which the Jews, I believe, understood it all the time, this is another form of, okay, I'm gonna overlay the same concept. Okay, there we go. So envision the blue is on the path of life, and over on the far right, I'm becoming increasingly selfish, and therefore, what am I liable to do to people? I'm going to begin to hurt them. Well, I take myself from the blessings of God over on the left to move myself where? I'm now starting to reposition myself because of hurtfulness where God will not react, but respond. So the question for anybody is, what part of God's heart do you want to experience? You notice this black or white, but if there were color, look at where the sun is. That's supposed to be little pine trees, by the way, okay, on the path. Life is beautiful there, but if I get away from the path, there's a desert type of experience that's supposed to get my attention. I've got no prayer life. I'm starting to become very dry as a person, but I'm also starting to become selfish, and the sunshine starts to become clouded. By what? The beginning of God's justice. Because the further I go to the right, the more hurtful I'm becoming. Why? Because the more selfish I'm becoming. So as I move to the right, I'm also descending downward, and I become the person on the right that doesn't have any knapsacks. Okay, so as I start to move to the right, a number of things will happen. Okay, now this adds another dimension. In the bottom, and we will go through this in future programs, two things are happening. Things are happening in the heavenly realms, and things are happening in terms of my character. If you see the little guy right in the middle, that is a guy that's in a tug of war with the devil, quite frankly. And you can't really see it here, but I'll have a more robust color picture in a moment. But right where those bottom right arrows are, that is supposed to be Niagara Falls. That this person right in the middle, and this is about where the fool starts. where the mocker morphs into the fool. So not only is it an intellectual thing, not only is it a character development thing, but also spiritually, the person is being pulled further and further to the point of no return. So as the person's character, and right in the middle, you'll see that arrow, the bottom arrow there, it says full conscience versus hardened conscience. And right in the middle is a twisting effect. So it reaches a point where conscience no longer works. So conscience is trying to pull the person back up to the top left on that bottom section. Look at the word empathy. We're going to look at the bottom half of this drawing. Somebody who's on the path has a lot of empathy and has full conscience. As they start to move downhill, eventually they will disregard their conscience and therefore they lose empathy. So they lose their conscience, they lose empathy, and then the very bottom left, that is the degree of selfishness. If somebody's on the path of life, they have very little selfishness. But the further they go over time, what happens to their degree of selfishness? So there's an inverted or inverse relationship, a converse relationship between selfishness and conscience and empathy and remorse. Those are in direct opposition. So to the extent that I have empathy and conscience, or to the extent that my conscience works, I have complete empathy and complete remorse if I do something wrong, and very little selfishness. But as time goes on, if I violate my conscience, what happens to my empathy? It goes down. What happens to my remorse? It goes down. It decreases. And it becomes increasing. There's a force that starts. It becomes easier and easier, and then the pull. And one has to consider there's a spiritual dynamic to it. That's what's happening within me. Now, look on the top of this chart. On the top of this chart, it's a little small to see, but what's happening is this. This is what's happening in the heavenly realm. Because as the person is becoming selfish, if I get off the path, then at first it's a private issue. I'm not really hurting anybody at first, but I'm starting to treat people in a way as less than, but there's a degree, -1, -2. Okay, this is another way of viewing it. This person is going downhill. So the person on the right, as they start to treat people disrespectfully or devalue them, they may or may not be aware immediately that you are devaluing them. So again, we're going to look at this chart again. Okay, so in that first category, the simple, but you also see the young, the wayward, right there, the borderline between the mocker, right? In that first category are what we might call private sins. Those are things that haven't manifested themselves yet. Okay, so there's no real overt hurtfulness, so God hasn't stepped in. But there's some storm clouds that are starting to build. Look at the top left quadrant. And that's supposed to be a thermometer there, right about maybe -4, right? -3, -4. What's happening at that point is, that may not be equidistant, but anyways, there's a point at which God is starting to note when I start to negatively impact someone. It's moving from attitude to action. That's when the shift takes place from his concern to me. It's his kindness that leads us to repentance. If I resist that, then God's focus shifts away from me and onto protecting the person I'm negatively impacting. And as I continue to be hurtful, what's going to happen? I start to hurt people, and their pain starts to rise to the heavens. In Psalm 56:8, look at that little bottle there. God says that he captures our tears in a bottle. Tears from what? Wanderings. The word for tears is wanderings. What are the wanderings? From oppression. So to the extent that somebody is becoming selfish, look at that red arrow. It's becoming thicker and thicker. It's right under the word personal. If I'm that selfish person, I am starting to now perpetrate personal injury. And therefore, the pain, the sighs, the cries of those I'm hurting are starting to rise to the heavens. So my injustice is increasing and the pain I'm creating is increasing, and God hears that. And what does he do? And you can see right under the bottle it says negligence. So I can still be hurtful if I'm negligent, but at some point in time, it moves to injustice. God will bring a significant emotional event. Look at that tornado right about in the middle, right between the word personal and injustice. God is going to bring something into the oppressor's life, the selfish person's life, to get their attention. But if that doesn't work, what's going to happen? They move into the zone of destruction. And you can see the thermometer where the sins and the pain they have caused has increased to a point where God is ready to act. And so the Jews understood that if any of them became a fool, whether the Jews or somebody that was not a Jew, whether anybody moved into the realm of the fool, whether the Jews or the Babylonians, that they were eligible for what? For destruction. Why? Because God cares about the pain of those that are on the receiving end of oppressors. So, how dare anyone give the message to someone that has been meaningfully and significantly negatively impacted that God doesn't take it seriously and therefore you don't have to worry about it and, you know what, just bury the hatchet? God doesn't say that. His answer to those that are being negatively impacted are imprecatory prayers, which is, hold tight, I'm on the way. I will take care of it here. And Jesus, you're going to find next week, Jesus never changed that. He still offers that same hope to the survivor. That is the greatest message to the heart of the survivor, that God knows, he sees, he cares, and he will respond. And we will see how you can see that play out, even in the Sermon on the Mount, next time on Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, Jon Uhler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with Jon, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with Jon, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.